Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast and thank you for tuning into this solo episode. The last solo episode was an overrated versus underrated type of episode about fat loss. And this time I am going to do an overrated versus underrated episode about bulking or building muscle in a surplus. I'm also going to try and learn from my previous mistakes. I will not be listing off the variables I'm going to cover using numbers, since I lost count last time. I am simply going to say, and the next variable I want to cover is this. Having said that, let's begin with the first variable, which is discipline. In my view, discipline is underrated because since a surplus is the largest calorie budget that you're going to have, most people assume that bulking is a walk in the park. But if you want to get good results, it is not. For one, being consistent with training requires discipline and planning, whether you're in a surplus, at maintenance, or in a deficit. Moreover, training with targeted form and consistently close enough to failure is fucking hard. In a surplus, you're going to have more energy. That's true. So you'll be able to push yourself harder than when you're at maintenance or in a deficit. But pushing harder means that you'll also find it harder to recover. From a nutritional standpoint, it's easy to let yourself get a little too complacent with food when you have a lot of calories available. Some people start eating way too many highly palatable foods. Their diet quality suffers, their training quality goes down as a result, and now they're not maximizing their muscle growth potential anymore. So they might be gaining weight, but they could be gaining more muscle if their diet was more nutritious. In addition to that, if they're overshooting their calorie target more often than not, now they may be gaining weight at an unnecessary fast pace, which is going to result in a greater percentage of fat gain than they would like, because muscle cannot be force fed. Muscle growth is dependent on your training. So if you're following the exact training program, the same exact training program, but in one universe you're eating in a 500 calorie surplus, and in one universe you're eating in a 300 calorie surplus, and that training program that you're on is helping you maximize the speed at which you can build muscle, then eating the extra 200 calories will not build extra muscle. It will make you gain a little bit more fat. At this moment in time, we don't really have research to tell us how big of a surplus would be ideal, and I have plenty of other episodes in which I cover my thoughts on that, so I'm not going to spend any time discussing that. In any case, some people end up eating too many highly palatable foods and sometimes too many calories. Other people underestimate how difficult it can be to eat enough. These individuals tend to have an adaptive metabolism, so they end up in a far larger surplus than they originally anticipated. For instance, I have a couple of clients who, before their bulk, were maintaining on around 2200 calories. So I would have expected for them to be able to build muscle and gain weight on 2400 calories, but with their metabolism being adaptive, as soon as I started increasing their calories, they subconsciously started moving more and expanding more calories. So they ended up having to eat 2,900 to 3,000 calories in order to actually gain weight. In this case, such a high calorie target can become an actual burden because these are also the type of people that tend to feel full when they still have several hundred calories to eat. Especially because, in my experience, people with an adaptive metabolism who need to bulk on such high calories are also people who have a relatively low appetite. So far, I've never had a client who loves to eat and can pack away calories relatively easily, requiring these many calories. It's always the people who tend to be a little bit on the thinner side, the slimmer side, unless they try really, really hard. So, as a result of that, for them, these high calorie targets is almost like a second job, and they tend to feel full when they still have several hundred calories to eat. So, they have to push the boundaries of their natural appetite every day in order to achieve their calorie targets. In my view, a bulking phase can be far easier than a fat loss phase because of the extra food flexibility, but it does have these unique challenges I've just discussed. That's why discipline, in my opinion, is equally important in both phases. The next variable I want to cover, which I won't spend a ton of time on because I talk about this all the time when I talk about bulking, but this variable is training, and I think it's underrated because most people focus more on their caloric budget than on their training program, as far as I have seen on social media and talking to potential clients. But training is the only stimulus for muscle growth that we know of except for steroids. A calorie surplus will support muscle growth, but it's not going to stimulate it directly. So if you're skipping workouts more often than not, or your training quality isn't the best, but you're nailing your surplus like a professional eater, you've got your priorities backwards. You need to pay a lot more attention to the consistency and the quality of your training. Moving on, the next variable is a big surplus. And when I say big, I'm talking 500 plus calories. I think this is overrated. There is an old school bodybuilding saying that you might have heard, which is eat big to get big. And based on this, old school bodybuilding practices involved eating 500 to 1,000 calories above maintenance calories. Now, thanks to some relatively recent research, we now know that, as I said earlier, you cannot force feed muscle growth. Admittedly, this research is still pretty sparse, but it's better than the crickets and the rolling ball of hay that we used to have on this topic. If you want to delve deeply into it, I discussed this in depth with Dr. Eric Helms in episode 61. How large should your surplus be? But here, I'm gonna give you the cliff notes. The larger the surplus, the faster you gain weight. However, beyond a certain caloric threshold, you're likely gaining more body fat and roughly the same amount of muscle mass, assuming the training program is the same, like I said earlier. The reason is that what dictates the speed at which you grow is the stimulus provided by training, not the amount of calories that you eat. And in my coaching experience, for smaller individuals training around 4 days per week, 1 to 200 calories above maintenance can be more than enough to encourage a productive rate of muscle growth with very little body fat gain. The next variable is your nutritional structure, which I think is underrated. And those who tend to underrate this the most are the people who complain that no matter how much they eat, they can't gain any weight. Again, of course, I'm not basing these underrated versus overrated opinions on statistics. It is only based on what I have seen in my practice as a coach and talking to other people in the fitness community. In any case, this is the type of person who I have seen underrate nutritional structure and also struggle the most to gain weight. The thing is, if you're not gaining weight, you're not in a surplus. And if you're consistently undershooting your calorie targets, it's because you don't have a nutritional structure to support your caloric needs. So these are three ways in which you can troubleshoot your current nutritional structure. Number one, if you're not planning your meals in advance already, you need to start. Number two, if you forget to eat, write yourself a meal schedule and set up some alarms and reminders to go off when it's time to make food and or eat it, so that you're not left with 1,000+ calories to eat by the time dinner comes around, in which case I would understand why you would be undershooting your target, because that is a ton of food to eat just at the end of the day. Number three, if you're not hungry enough to finish your current meals, you want to eat potentially smaller amounts of food more often. In addition to implementing the nutritional strategies I recommended in episodes 139 and 140 of this podcast, which were a two-part podcast series on bulking, and they are collectively titled A Comprehensive Guide to Bulking, Parts 1 and 2. The next variable, which are actually two variables paired together, are sleep and stress management, yet two more underrated variables. Don't get me wrong, no one is perfect with sleep and stress management in this day and age, but perfection isn't expected. The problem is, most people focus on the X's and O's of nutrition and training without really taking into account the impact that a good sleep routine and an appropriate stress management strategy can have on their ability to build muscle. Starting with sleep, evidence shows that getting too little sleep on a regular basis can lead to the same amount of weight loss in the same calorie deficit, but it may lead to a greater amount of fat-free mass loss, which includes muscle mass, and a smaller amount of fat mass loss, which is the exact opposite of what you would want in a calorie deficit. And while I'm not aware of any direct studies on bulking and sleep, it seems sensible to me to expect that the better your sleep quality, the more muscle you'll be able to build, if for no other reason that you're going to have more energy to channel into training, thus making it more stimulative overall. If you want to learn more about the benefits of sleep on fat loss and muscle gain, with a ton of practical tips that are also evidence-based on how to sleep better and or for longer, I've got a blog article on that, and you can check out the show notes because I'm going to put a link to that there. With regard to the role of stress management in a bulking phase, the main principle you want to understand is that the body pulls from the same energy reservoir in order to deal with all sources of stress, whether they're psychological or physical. In other words, whether you've just trained hard or whether you've just had a screaming match with your manager at work, the body processes and recovers from these two stressors using the same resources. And we only have finite resources for all of our stressors. That's why managing stress, as well as you are able to, is important, so that you always have the resources available for the body to adapt to the stress that comes from training. Because if you cannot adapt to training stress, you will not be able to grow. Again, I want to stress that I do not have the perfect sleep and stress management routine. I want to stress. Pun not intended but acknowledged. And also, it would be ludicrous of me to expect this of any client. If you're studying, if you're working, if you have a family, we're not trying to, in quotation marks, optimize your sleep and stress management routine. But the better you are able to look after your sleep and stress, the better your results are likely going to be. And I keep mentioning that we don't need perfection because I also don't want to discourage anyone from bulking because their sleep and stress management aren't, again, in quotation marks, optimal. There are some extreme cases in which I would recommend a client wait until they're sleeping a little bit better or managing their stress a little bit better before they go into a surplus. But these are pretty extreme. If you are waiting for the best time in your life when your sleep is excellent and your stress is super low, at that point you're going to bulk for a week when you go on holiday, and that's not really productive for physique changes either. So it's important to understand that sleep and stress management aren't either perfect or imperfect, but there's a spectrum that you want to consider. And the closer you can get to the better end of the spectrum, the better your results are likely going to be. But equally, if you're further away from that, it doesn't mean that you should not bulk at all. So hopefully this is clear, and I don't want to keep belaboring the points because I think I would risk repeating myself. So I'm going to move on to the next variable, which is scale weight. And in my view, this is overrated because muscle growth occurs at a much slower rate than fat loss. So in a deficit, you can use weekly scale weight averages in order to assess fat loss progress. It may take a little bit longer if you have a regular menstrual cycle, as I covered in plenty of episodes, but weekly, fortnightly scale weight averages work pretty well. You cannot do the same in a bulking phase, which is why in a surplus, I'd only recommend checking your scale weight trend every 2 to 4 weeks. And for people who menstruate, 4 weeks is usually better. Furthermore, since fat loss is typically faster than muscle growth, the speed at which you lose scale weight in a deficit is more closely correlated with actual fat loss than the speed at which you gain weight in a surplus is correlated with actual muscle growth. For example, if you lost 1 pound in the last 2 weeks, it's reasonable to expect that most of it is body fat. But if you gained 1 pound in the last 2 weeks, much less of it is likely going to be new muscle mass in comparison. So when I check my client's scale weight in a bulking phase, I do it every 2 to 4 weeks, but I'm under no illusion that if they've gained a pound, most of it is going to be body fat. I'm mainly checking that over time we are staying within the percentage of weight gain that I deem appropriate to maximize muscle growth and minimize fat gain for their specific situation, rather than making any assessments around how much muscle they might have gained. Because realistically, with the tools that we have at this moment in time, the best way to assess how much muscle you've actually built is if you start a bulking phase at a certain body weight, you end it 5, 10, 15 pounds heavier, however much you end up gaining, and then you bring your body weight back down to your starting point with a fat loss phase. At that point, you compare your starting pictures at that body weight to your pictures at the same body weight at the end of both the bulking phase and the fat loss phase. And at that point, you can see if you look more muscular and leaner at the same body weight, then happy days, you have gained significant muscle mass. That is the most accurate way to establish that. So it takes a lot more patience than just checking your body weight every 2 to 4 weeks. And the bottom line is, even though scale weight is a useful metric, far too many people that I have seen obsess over the daily and weekly fluctuations when they're bulking, when these are not nearly as useful as they tend to be in a calorie deficit. The last variable I am going to rate is trust in the process, which, from my perspective, is vastly underrated. As I was saying before, to my knowledge, I don't think we have particularly reliable tools to assess muscle growth during a bulk like we do during a fat loss phase, at least in the short term. So these are the main tools that I personally use in my coaching practice and personal experience: training performance, scale weight, and physique pictures. During a bulk, however, these tools suggest whether you're moving in the right direction or not, but they cannot tell you with any particular degree of accuracy how many grams of muscle you're putting on. On the other hand, fat loss spoils us with immediately noticeable results. As I said earlier, if you lose 5 pounds of scale weight, in many cases you'll notice a significant difference in your physique right away, unless you carry so much excess body fat that you need to lose more weight before these changes become more apparent. Now, there are some cases when this can happen during a bulking phase too, but it's not as reliable and the timescale is typically a lot longer. If it's your first bulk ever, you may be able to notice relatively significant changes in muscle growth when you compare your physique to the beginning of the bulk after around 6 months. Even if you're going to carry a little bit more body fat, you might still be able to see actual increases in muscle growth. Now, if you're very advanced, the most observable change is likely going to be fat gain rather than muscle, simply because fat tissue sits on top of muscle. So you're better off comparing pictures of your physique from previous years when you were at the same body weight, as opposed to comparing pictures of your physique from the start of the bulk to wherever you're at in the current bulk right now. That's why, while everyone's always banging on about the importance of trusting the process during a fat loss phase, and that includes me, I bang on about it all the time, I also think that this is even more relevant in a bulking phase, just because it takes so much longer to see appreciable results. Now, to wrap up this episode, in summary, these are the main components of a bulk that you want to prioritize for long-term success. Number 1, training. Number 2, discipline. Number 3, a moderate surplus. Number 4, an effective nutritional structure that enables you to get in the calories and macros required. Number 5, your sleep routine and stress management strategy. And number 6, trust in the process. And that is the end of today's solo episode and a wrap for these 2-part underrated versus overrated type podcast episodes. As always, all of the resources are linked in the show notes. If you want to sign up for coaching, you can do that by clicking on the links in the show notes below as well. Thank you very much for lending me your ear, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.